The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. on October 12, 2018. The voice on the other end was strained, nearly drowned out by wind that howled like something alive. "Command, this is Rescue 7. We've got his helmet, just the helmet, no sign of Graves." The dispatcher in Millbrook County, Pennsylvania, went silent for 3 seconds that felt like minutes. Then, "Repeat that. Rescue 7. You found what?" "His helmet. Mark Graves' helmet. It's just sitting here in the middle of Route 40, 32 miles from the last known location. There's no vehicle, no footprints, nothing else. It's like he just stopped existing." Mark Graves had responded to a routine brush fire that evening in the hills west of Millbrook. A simple call. The kind volunteer firefighters handle dozens of times each autumn when the leaves turn dry and careless campers leave embers smoldering. He'd radioed in at 9:15 p.m. to confirm he was on scene. At 9:33 p.m., his voice came through one last time. "Command, I'm seeing something strange up here. Going to check it out." Then silence. What happened in those missing 2 hours? How does a man vanish from a contained fire scene, only for his department-issued helmet to appear 30 miles away on a stretch of highway he had no reason to travel? Why was the helmet's visor cracked in a way that suggested immense pressure, yet showed no other signs of damage? The answers, when they finally emerged, painted a picture far more disturbing than anyone in Millbrook County could have imagined. This is the story of Mark Graves, devoted husband, father of 2, 17-year veteran of the Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department. And this is the story of what truly happened on that October night when the boundary between duty and obsession blurred into something unrecognizable. If you're ready to follow the trail that investigators spent 6 months piecing together, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more mysteries that keep you awake at night. And drop a comment below with your theories, because by the end of this story, you'll need somewhere to put all the questions racing through your mind. Let's begin where it all started. Not in chaos, but in the deceptive calm of an ordinary autumn evening. September had been unusually dry in Millbrook County, the kind of dry that made the forest floor crunch underfoot, that turned every cigarette butt into a potential catastrophe. By early October, the volunteer fire department had responded to 11 brush fires in 3 weeks, more than they'd seen in the previous 2 years combined. Mark Graves loved every minute of it. At 43 years old, Mark had spent nearly half his life running toward fires while others ran away. His wife, Jennifer, often joked that he loved the firehouse more than he loved home, though the smile never quite reached her eyes when she said it. Their daughters, Emma, 14, and Sophie, 11, had grown up understanding that Daddy's pager could interrupt any dinner, any birthday, any quiet Sunday afternoon. But Mark wasn't just dedicated. According to the 17 other volunteers who served alongside him, he was becoming something else entirely. "It started maybe 6 months before he disappeared," said Deputy Chief Robert Hendricks in his official statement. Mark began taking extra shifts, volunteering for calls even when he wasn't on rotation. He'd show up at the station at odd hours just to check equipment that had already been checked. When we asked him about it, he'd get this distant look and say he just wanted to be ready. Ready for what? No one thought to ask. The Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department operated out of a modest brick building on the edge of town, flanked by farmland on one side and the dense Appalachian foothills on the other. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where funeral processions still stopped traffic out of respect, where a man's word and his handshake meant something. Mark had grown up 20 miles north, in a town even smaller than Millbrook. His father had been a coal miner, one of the last generation to work the deep shafts before they closed for good in the early 1990s. Mark never went into the mines. He'd told Jennifer once, early in their marriage, that he'd watched his father come home every night, covered in darkness, and he'd sworn he'd spend his life in the light instead. Firefighting seemed like the natural choice. Light versus darkness. Order versus chaos. And for 17 years, it had been exactly that. Until something changed. Jennifer Graves sat across from investigators in late October, 2 weeks after her husband vanished, and struggled to pinpoint exactly when Mark had shifted from dedicated to disturbed. "He stopped sleeping normally," she said, her fingers worrying the edge of a tissue. "I'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning, and he'd be sitting at the kitchen table just staring at topographical maps of the county. When I asked him what he was looking for, he'd say he was studying response routes. But the way he studied them, it was like he was searching for something specific, something he couldn't quite name." In the weeks before October 12th, Mark had begun carrying a notebook everywhere, a small leather-bound thing that he'd write in at odd moments, during commercial breaks, at red lights, once even during Emma's orchestra concert. When Jennifer finally asked to see it, he'd closed it gently and told her it was just work notes. Nothing to worry about. The notebook was never found. But investigators did find something else in the weeks following Mark's disappearance. A pattern in the brush, fires themselves. Of the 11 fires that had occurred since mid-September, 9 had been in locations that formed an almost perfect arc across the western hills of Millbrook County. Each fire had been small, contained, seemingly random. But when plotted on a map, they created a curved line pointing toward something, toward the old Millbrook Fire Observation Tower, abandoned since 1987. Mark Graves had responded to every single one of those 9 fires, and according to radio logs, he'd been the first to arrive at 7 of them. The Millbrook Fire Observation Tower stood 70 feet tall on the spine of Hartwell Ridge, a steel skeleton wrapped in decay and warnings. Condemned. Keep out. Danger of collapse. The signs had been there for 30 years, ever since the Forest Service had shuttered the tower in favor of aerial surveillance and satellite detection. Most locals had forgotten it existed. It was just another relic of a vanishing America, slowly being reclaimed by rust and ivy. But Mark Graves hadn't forgotten. "I didn't think much of it at first," said Thomas Waverly, a fellow volunteer who'd ridden with Mark to 2 of the September fires. But looking back, Mark always wanted to stage on the east side of every call, the side that gave you a clear line of sight to Hartwell Ridge. I caught him staring up at that tower once, through binoculars. When I asked him what he was looking at, he said he thought he'd seen smoke, but there was no smoke. The sky was clear. October 12th began like any autumn day in Millbrook County. Mark dropped Emma at school, kissed Jennifer goodbye, and headed to his day job as a maintenance supervisor at the county water treatment plant. Colleagues later reported nothing unusual about his behavior. He ate lunch alone in his truck, as he often did. He completed his rounds. He clocked out at 4:30 p.m. At 5:47 p.m., he stopped at Brennan's Hardware on Main Street and purchased 3 items: a high-powered flashlight, 50 feet of climbing rope, and a compass. The clerk, Dylan Brennan, remembered the transaction clearly. I asked him if he was planning some kind of hiking trip. He just smiled and said he was preparing for a night shift. That's all. Mark went home. He ate dinner with his family, meatloaf, Jennifer's specialty. He helped Sophie with her math homework. He watched 20 minutes of a forensic documentary with Emma, who wanted to be a crime scene investigator. By all accounts, it was an evening as ordinary as breathing. Then, at 8:52 p.m., the pager sounded. Brush fire reported on Hollow Creek Trail, West Sector. All available volunteers respond. Mark grabbed his gear and was out the door in 90 seconds. Jennifer barely had time to say goodbye. That was normal. That was what firefighter families learned to live with. The sudden departures, the interrupted moments, the constant low-grade anxiety that lived in the background of every "I love you." But this time, Jennifer would later tell investigators, Mark had paused at the door, just for a second. He'd looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not fear, exactly. Not sadness. Something closer to resolution. "Be back soon," he'd said. Those were the last words she ever heard him speak. Mark arrived at the Hollow Creek staging area at 9:11 p.m. 4 other volunteers were already there, deploying hand tools and marking containment lines for what appeared to be a small fire, maybe half an acre, burning slowly through dry undergrowth. Standard autumn maintenance burning, likely sparked by an illegal campfire. Chief Hendricks assigned sectors. Mark took the northwest quadrant, the area closest to Hartwell Ridge. At 9:15 p.m., he radioed confirmation. Command Graves, I'm on site, northwest sector. Beginning containment line. For the next 18 minutes, Mark's radio was silent. This wasn't unusual. Volunteers often worked without constant communication, especially on routine calls. But at 9:33 p.m., Mark's voice came through the radio again. And this time, something was different. Command, this is Graves. I'm seeing something strange up here. Going to check it out. Deputy Chief Hendricks responded immediately. Graves, define strange. What's your location? Static. Graves, respond. More static then. I'm about 200 yards northwest of my sector. It looks like someone's been up here. Recently. There are markings. Markings? Graves, clarify. The final transmission was barely audible, broken by interference that technicians later couldn't explain. They're on the trees, carved into the bark. They're leading toward silence. Mark Graves never completed that sentence, and he never made another radio transmission. The search began at 10:47 p.m. after repeated attempts to raise Mark on the radio failed. Chief Hendricks pulled volunteers from containment operations and organized a systematic sweep of the northwest sector. The brush fire was nearly contained by then anyway. A small mercy in what was about to become Millbrook County's most baffling missing person case. They found Mark's water canister first, sitting upright on a fallen log approximately 300 yards from where he'd last been assigned. The canister was half full, cap still attached, no signs of struggle, no indication it had been dropped or thrown, just placed there. 50 yards beyond that, they found fresh boot prints in the soft earth near a seasonal creek bed, size 11, matched to Mark's department-issued boots. The prints led northwest, away from the fire. Away from the staging area, they led uphill toward the ridgeline, toward the old observation tower. The prints were purposeful, State Police investigator Sarah Martinson noted in her report. Not running, not fleeing, a steady, deliberate pace. The stride length suggested normal walking speed. Whatever Mark was following, he wasn't afraid of it. The search team followed the boot prints for nearly a mile. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the skeletal trees of autumn, their bare branches clawing at a moonless sky. The air had turned cold, unseasonably so, and several volunteers later reported an unusual stillness to the forest. No night birds, no rustling of small animals, just the crunch of boots on dead leaves and the sound of men calling Mark's name into an indifferent wilderness. At 11:23 p.m., they reached the base of the old fire tower. The boot prints ended there, in a small clearing where the grass had been trampled down in a rough circle. In the center of that circle were the markings Mark had mentioned in his last transmission. They weren't carved into bark. They were carved into the earth itself. Someone had used a sharp implement, perhaps a knife or a sharpened stick, to gouge symbols into the ground. Not letters, not words, but geometric patterns that radiated outward from a central point. Chief Hendricks, who'd been a volunteer firefighter for 26 years and had seen his share of peculiar things in the Pennsylvania hills, stood at the edge of that circle and felt something cold settle in his stomach. It looked deliberate, he later testified, like someone had been working on it for a long time. The edges of the symbols were weathered, like they'd been cut days or maybe even weeks earlier, but there was fresh dirt around them too, like someone had been maintaining them, reinforcing them. There was no sign of Mark Graves. The search continued through the night, expanding outward in concentric circles from the tower. By dawn, 20 additional volunteers and a state police search and rescue unit had joined the effort. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, swept the ridgeline. K-9 units worked the scent trail. Every ravine, every cave, every abandoned structure within a 5-mile radius was checked and rechecked. Nothing. Mark Graves had simply vanished from a contained area in the middle of a search operation, as if he'd been erased from existence. Then, at 11:47 p.m. on October 13th, exactly 24 hours after Mark's last transmission, the call came in from Route 40. A state trooper had been conducting a routine patrol on the highway that ran along the eastern edge of the county, 32 miles from Hartwell Ridge. In his headlights, sitting in the middle of the northbound lane, was a single object, a firefighter's helmet. Yellow, scratched, department issued, with Graves stenciled in reflective letters above the brim. The visor had been cracked, not shattered, but cracked in a distinctive pattern that radiated outward from a central impact point, as if something had pressed against it with enormous, focused pressure. Yet the rest of the helmet showed no signs of damage. No scratches, no dents, no blood. Inside the helmet, tucked into the suspension webbing, was a small piece of paper. The paper had been torn from a notebook, possibly the same leather notebook Mark had been carrying in the weeks before his disappearance. On it, in Mark's handwriting, were 4 words: "I found the pattern." The discovery of the helmet transformed the investigation from a search and rescue operation into something far more complex. State police established a command post in Millbrook and began the painstaking process of reconstructing Mark Graves' movements, his state of mind, and the increasingly strange circumstances surrounding the brush fires that had consumed his attention for weeks. Jennifer Graves granted investigators access to Mark's home office, a converted spare bedroom where he kept his firefighting certifications, training manuals, and personal files. What they found painted a picture of a man who had been conducting his own private investigation, though into what exactly remained unclear. The topographical maps Jennifer had mentioned were there, dozens of them covering every inch of western Millbrook County. Mark had marked each of the September brush fires with red dots. He'd drawn lines connecting them. He'd written notes in the margins, timestamps, weather conditions, wind directions, and he'd drawn something else. A series of concentric arcs, all centered on the old fire observation tower. But it was what investigators found beneath those maps that truly deepened the mystery. Mark had been researching the tower's history, printing articles from the local historical society's digital archives. The tower had been built in 1952, part of a nationwide network designed to spot forest fires before they could spread. It had been manned continuously from April through October each year until 1987, when budget cuts and new technology rendered it obsolete. Mark had highlighted one particular passage in an article from the Millbrook County Herald, dated October 15, 1986. Fire observer James Halloran disappears during night shift. The article was brief, relegated to page 7 of the local news section. James Halloran, a seasonal fire observer who'd worked the tower for 3 consecutive summers, had failed to check in during his scheduled radio call on the night of October 14, 1986. When rangers arrived the next morning, they found the tower empty. Halloran's personal effects were still there. His jacket, his lunchbox, his thermos of coffee, but Halloran himself was gone. He was never found. The case had been ruled a voluntary disappearance after investigators discovered that Halloran had been having financial difficulties and marital problems. The assumption was that he'd simply walked away from his life. It wasn't uncommon. People did it all the time, especially in rural areas where it was easy to vanish into the landscape. But Mark Graves had dug deeper. He'd obtained copies of the original incident reports through Freedom of Information requests. And in those reports, buried in the witness statements, was a detail that the 1986 newspaper article hadn't mentioned. The night Halloran disappeared, multiple residents in western Millbrook County had reported seeing unusual lights on Hartwell Ridge. Not lightning, not campfires, lights that moved in geometric patterns, weaving through the trees. Rangers had dismissed the reports as misidentifications of car headlights reflecting off low clouds. Case closed. Except, Mark had found something else. In the weeks before Halloran's disappearance, there had been a string of small brush fires in the hills west of Millbrook. 7 fires in 4 weeks, all in locations that formed an arc pointing toward the observation tower. The pattern was identical to 2018. Mark believed the fires weren't accidents, State Investigator Martinson concluded in her report. He believed someone was setting them deliberately, creating a pattern, but he never articulated why or what the pattern was supposed to accomplish. Either he didn't know, or he was afraid to commit his theory to writing. The question that haunted investigators: had Mark discovered something about those fires? Had he found evidence that the 1986 fires and the 2018 fires were connected? And if so, what did that connection mean? One piece of potential evidence emerged during the forensic analysis of the helmet. The crack in the visor had been examined by materials specialists at the State Crime Lab. Their finding was unsettling. The pressure required to create that specific crack pattern would have been approximately 2,000 pounds per square inch, the equivalent of an industrial press. Yet, there was no other damage to the helmet, no deformation of the shell, no compression of the protective foam inside. Just that single, precise crack in the visor, as if something had reached through the material itself and pressed against it from the inside. It's not physically possible, the lead forensic analyst stated flatly, at least not through any mechanism I'm familiar with. If you applied that much pressure to the visor, the entire helmet should have been crushed. Instead, we have what appears to be an isolated point of catastrophic stress failure, with no corresponding damage to the surrounding structure. It doesn't make sense. Adding to the strangeness, the helmet had been found 32 miles from Hartwell Ridge, on a stretch of highway that Mark had no reason to travel. His truck was still parked at the Hollow Creek staging area. There were no reports of him hitchhiking, no security camera footage showing him walking along Route 40, no witnesses who saw him anywhere near that stretch of road. The helmet had simply appeared there, as if it had been placed by an invisible hand. Winter came early to Millbrook County that year. By mid-November, snow had already begun accumulating in the hills, and the search for Mark Graves was officially suspended until spring. The state police kept the case open, but with no physical evidence beyond the helmet, no witnesses, and no plausible explanation for Mark's disappearance, the investigation effectively stalled. Jennifer Graves stopped giving interviews. The daughters stopped going to school regularly. The house on Maple Street, once filled with the sounds of family life, became a mausoleum of unanswered questions. But the mystery didn't end. In fact, it was just beginning to reveal its deeper patterns. In late November, a graduate student named Rebecca Torres contacted the state police. Torres was working on her doctorate in folklore and cultural anthropology at Penn State, and she'd become interested in the Graves case after reading about it in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Specifically, she was interested in the symbols that had been found carved into the ground near the fire tower. "I've seen similar patterns before," Torres explained in her initial call to investigator Martinson. "Not in Pennsylvania, but in historical accounts from other parts of the Appalachians. They show up in WPA interviews from the 1930s, in folklore collections, in old county records. They're called fire marks, or sometimes flame summons, depending on the region." According to Torres's research, the symbols were part of an obscure folk tradition that had once been practiced in isolated mountain communities. The tradition held that certain geometric patterns, when carved into the earth in specific locations, could call fire not to destroy, but to reveal, to illuminate hidden things, to make visible that which was meant to remain unseen. It was a kind of divination, Torres explained. People believed that if you created the marks correctly and maintained them properly, fire would come to those places. And if you followed the fires, if you traced their pattern, they would lead you to something. to knowledge, to truth, to whatever you were seeking. The practice had mostly died out by the mid-20th century, dismissed as superstition. But Torres had found references to it persisting in certain areas, including western Pennsylvania, well into the 1980s. What's interesting, Torres continued, is that the tradition always required a keeper, someone who maintained the marks, who reinforced them, who ensured they remained active. And according to the folklore, the keeper eventually had to complete the pattern themselves. They had to follow the fires all the way to the end. Investigator Martinson asked the obvious question: what happened to the keeper? Torres was quiet for a moment. Then, according to the stories, they vanished. That was the price of the knowledge. The keeper would learn what they sought to learn, but they couldn't bring that knowledge back. They became part of the pattern themselves. It sounded like folklore, superstition, the kind of story that belonged in dusty archives, not in a modern police investigation. But then Torres mentioned something that made Martinson pause. In the 1930s WPA interviews, there was an account from a woman in West Virginia who claimed her husband had been a fire mark keeper. He'd disappeared in 1933 after maintaining marks in the hills for nearly 2 years. Before he vanished, he told his wife that he was close to understanding the pattern, close to seeing what the fires wanted him to see. His body was never found. But 3 days after he disappeared, his hat was discovered 40 miles away, sitting in the middle of a logging road. The Millbrook County Sheriff's Office dispatched a team to examine the symbols near the fire tower more closely. What they found was disturbing. The symbols showed signs of maintenance. Fresh cuts overlaid older ones. The pattern had been reinforced multiple times, possibly over months or even years. And when technicians used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area around the tower, they discovered something beneath the surface. Approximately 8 feet down, directly under the center point of the carved symbols, there was an anomaly. Something that showed up on the imaging as a void, a hollow space in the earth where there should have been solid ground. Excavation began in early December, despite the snow. What the team found at that depth was a cavity, roughly 6 feet in diameter, lined with stones. It appeared to be an old well shaft, likely dating back to the 19th century, when there had been a logging camp on Hartwell Ridge. Inside the cavity were bones, human bones. 3 distinct individuals, based on preliminary analysis, all adult males, all showing signs of having been there for decades, possibly since the late 1800s. And carved into the stones lining the shaft were the same geometric patterns Mark had found on the surface. The pattern was older than anyone had imagined. It had been waiting for more than a century. The investigation into the Hartwell Ridge remains would take months, but the initial findings were enough to reshape the entire narrative of Mark Graves' disappearance. Carbon dating placed the bones between 1870 and 1890. Forensic analysis suggested the individuals had died from exposure. They'd been alive when they'd entered or been placed in that cavity, and they'd perished there over time. None of the remains were ever identified. There were no dental records, no missing person reports that matched the time period, no way to give names to the dead. They were simply 3 men who had vanished more than 100 years ago, drawn to that place by something that had written its pattern into the Pennsylvania hills. Mark Graves' case was never officially solved. His body was never recovered. But in the months following the discovery at Hartwell Ridge, certain pieces of evidence emerged that suggested a trajectory, if not a conclusion. A hiker reported finding Mark's leather notebook in March 2019, tucked beneath a rock overhang about 12 miles from the tower. The notebook had been damaged by weather, but several pages remained legible. They contained observations about the fires, sketches of the symbols, and increasingly fragmented entries that suggested Mark had been unraveling some kind of code. The final entry, dated October 11th, 2018, 1 day before his disappearance, read, "The pattern isn't random. It's a map, not of places, but of moments. Each fire marks a point where something thin happened, where the boundary wore through. Halloran understood this. The others before him understood this. Tomorrow night, if the wind is right, there will be another fire, and I'll be there. I'll follow it all the way through. I have to know what they saw. Jennifer Graves read that entry in the state police office, her hands shaking. He was chasing something that didn't exist, she said quietly. He convinced himself there was meaning in random events, that there was a pattern where there was only coincidence and tragedy. But was it coincidence? The question lingered. The brush fires stopped after October 12, 2018. For the next 3 fire seasons, western Millbrook County experienced its typical number of small blazes, 1 or 2 per autumn, easily contained, no pattern to them whatsoever. Whatever had been drawing those fires to specific locations had ceased. The observation tower was dismantled in 2020, deemed a public safety hazard and a liability. The symbols near its base were photographed, documented, and then destroyed as part of the demolition. The well shaft was filled in with concrete. The bones were given a proper burial in Millbrook's Municipal Cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, "Unknown, Remembered." Mark Graves was declared legally dead in October 2024, 7 years after his disappearance. There was a memorial service attended by his family, fellow firefighters, and a community that had never stopped wondering what happened that October night. His name was added to the department's memorial wall, not as a line-of-duty death, but as a missing member. A man who had run toward something the rest of them couldn't see. The helmet remains in state police evidence storage, tagged and sealed. The crack in the visor has never been adequately explained. Neither has the helmet's appearance 32 miles from where Mark was last seen. These facts exist without context, without resolution, small impossibilities that resist every attempt at rational explanation. Rebecca Torres published her dissertation on Appalachian fire folklore in 2021. In the acknowledgments, she mentioned Mark Graves by name, calling him a modern seeker who perhaps found what he was looking for, though at a cost none of us can fully comprehend. What did Mark find in those woods? Did he follow the pattern to its conclusion? Did he see what Halloran saw, what those 3 nameless men from the 1880s saw? Did he discover something true in those hills, or did he simply lose himself to obsession and the indifferent wilderness? The answer, like Mark himself, remains missing. But here's what we know for certain. There are patterns in the world that exist beneath our notice, connections that span decades, centuries, perhaps longer, and sometimes someone notices them. Someone becomes convinced that if they can just trace those patterns far enough, they'll discover something profound, something that explains the inexplicable. The danger isn't that those patterns don't exist. The danger is that they might, and that following them all the way through requires a price we're not meant to pay. Mark Graves paid it. In the end, he became part of the very mystery he sought to solve. Another point on a map that only makes sense to those who've already lost themselves in trying to understand it. The Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department still operates out of that modest brick building on the edge of town. New volunteers have taken Mark's place on the roster. Life continues, as it always does in the wake of unanswered questions. But on quiet October nights, when the leaves turn dry and the first frost edges the windows, the volunteers sometimes talk about Mark Graves, about his dedication that became obsession, about the helmet that appeared where it shouldn't have been, about the possibility, however remote, however irrational, that he found exactly what he was looking for, and that finding it meant never coming home.